I remember that night so clearly because it was the first time my parents looked me straight in the eyes and told me, in the calmest voice possible, that I was a failure who would never become anything. And if that had been all, maybe I would have just swallowed it like I always did, like I had done for years, pretending it didn't hurt as much as it actually did. But the problem was that only a few minutes later, they told me something that was even worse. They said I owed them everything I had, every dollar I had worked for, as if everything I had built somehow already belonged to them. In that moment, I didn't fully understand what was happening, but looking back now, I realized that this was never really about money, because everything that led to that night had been building up for years. I grew up in a family where love always felt conditional, where you weren't valued for who you were, but for how well you managed to meet expectations that kept getting higher no matter how hard you tried. My parents never seemed abusive to anyone on the outside. They didn't scream without reason, and they always knew how to present themselves as supportive and caring people, but inside the house every word carried weight, and every mistake stayed with me far longer than any success ever did. I was constantly reminded that I could do better, that I should try harder, and that there was always someone else doing more than me, someone I should be more like, and after a while I stopped questioning it and just assumed that something about me simply wasn't enough. But there was one moment that changed everything for me, a moment I was never supposed to hear, and one that I still wish I could forget. I overheard my mom talking, and she said that I wasn't going to make it, that they couldn't rely on me, and what hurt the most wasn't even the words themselves, but how easily they came out, like she had believed that for a very long time. After that moment, something in me changed, even though on the outside everything stayed exactly the same, because I still lived in the same house, followed the same rules, and pretended like their words hadn't affected me as much as they actually had. I tried to focus on what they always told me mattered the most, which was getting into a good college, proving that I wasn't a disappointment, and finally becoming someone they could be proud of, but no matter how much effort I put in, it never seemed to be enough. When I didn't get into the university they had chosen for me, it felt like everything collapsed at once, not just for them, but for me too, because deep down I still hoped that if I did things right, they would finally see me differently. Instead, that was the moment they stopped even pretending to believe in me. They started calling me lazy, saying that I lacked discipline, that I wasn't serious about my future, and every conversation slowly turned into a reminder that I had failed in the one thing that actually mattered to them. At first it was just words, but over time it turned into something more controlling, something that made me realize this was no longer just about disappointment. They began limiting my access to money, questioning every small expense, asking me where I was going, who I was meeting, and why I wasn't doing more to fix my life, as if I had somehow fallen behind everyone else and needed to catch up immediately. It felt like I was no longer their daughter, but some kind of investment that wasn't paying off the way they expected. And the more they tried to control me, the more I understood that no matter what I did, I would always be seen as not enough in their eyes. But what they didn't know was that while all of this was happening, while they were slowly losing respect for me, I had already started building something they couldn't see. Something I never told them about. Something that would eventually change everything. At some point, without really planning it, I stopped trying to prove anything to them and started focusing on something completely different, something that didn't depend on their approval or their expectations. It began with small things late at night, when everyone in the house was asleep and no one could question what I was doing or tell me I was wasting my time, and at first it didn't feel like anything serious, just a way to escape from everything that was happening around me. I started taking on small online jobs, the kind that don't seem like much in the beginning, simple tasks, small payments, nothing that would impress anyone, especially not my parents, which is exactly why I never told them about it. At home I stayed the same person they believed I was, quiet, unremarkable, someone who had already failed in their eyes, and I let them think that because it made everything easier. But little by little things began to change. The small payments turned into something more stable, the work became more consistent, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was actually moving forward, even if no one else could see it. What started as a distraction slowly became something real, something I could rely on, something that was mine. And the more it grew, the more careful I became about keeping it a secret. Not because I was afraid they would stop me, but because I knew they wouldn't understand it, and more importantly, I knew they wouldn't respect it. So I learned to live two different lives at the same time. One where I was still the failure they saw every day, and another where I was quietly building something that didn't need their validation. There were nights when I barely slept, days when I felt exhausted pretending to be someone I wasn't, but every time I saw the numbers slowly increasing, every time I realized I had earned more than the day before, it reminded me that I was no longer stuck where they thought I was. And then, at some point, without any big announcement or dramatic moment, everything crossed a line I didn't even realize I had reached. I wasn't just making a little money anymore. I was making more than I had ever imagined. More than enough to prove them wrong. More than enough to change my life completely. And the strangest part was that they still had no idea. For a long time, I thought I could keep everything separate, that as long as I stayed quiet and didn't give them a reason to look closer, they would never find out what I was actually doing. And honestly, that worked until it didn't. I still don't know exactly how it happened, whether someone mentioned it without thinking, or if they simply started paying more attention, but one day the questions changed, and the way they looked at me felt different, like they were trying to figure something out instead of just judging me. At first it was subtle, small comments, random questions about money, about what I was doing online, about why I suddenly didn't seem as lost as before, and I tried to brush it off, to keep everything as normal as possible, but I could feel that something was shifting. And then one evening, everything came out at once. They sat me down like it was some kind of serious family discussion, the kind where you already know you're not being asked anything, you're just being told what's going to happen. My father looked at me and asked me directly how much money I had. Not if I had any, just how much. And in that moment, I realized that they already knew. Maybe not everything, but enough. I tried to stay calm, to avoid giving a clear answer, but it didn't matter, because they weren't really asking, they were waiting for confirmation. And when they got it, everything changed. There was no surprise, no pride, no moment of, we didn't expect this from you. Instead, my father leaned back like everything finally made sense to him, and said something that didn't even sound like a suggestion. He said that those money problems they had been dealing with could finally be solved, that the timing was actually perfect. And for a second, I didn't understand what he meant. Until he explained it. They had already made plans. They had already spoken to people, discussed a business opportunity, and promised an investment they couldn't afford on their own, because in their mind, they didn't need to. They were counting on my money, not asking for it, counting on it, like it was already theirs. And the more they talked about it, the more detailed it became, the clearer it was that this wasn't something they had just come up with in that moment. This was something they had already decided, something they fully expected me to agree to without hesitation. Because to them, it wasn't even a question. I was their daughter, which meant everything I had belonged to them. For a moment, I just sat there listening to them talk about my money like it was already part of their plan, like my opinion didn't matter, like the decision had already been made without me. And the strangest part was that they didn't even sound aggressive, they sounded confident, almost relaxed, like this was the most natural thing in the world, like this was simply how things were supposed to work. That I would give, and they would decide. And I realized something in that moment that I think I had been avoiding for a long time. This was never going to change. No matter what I achieved, no matter how hard I worked, they would always see me as something they could control. So for the first time, I didn't try to explain myself, I didn't argue, and I didn't look for the right words to make them understand me. I just said no. At first, they thought I wasn't serious. They smiled like I had just said something naive, something they could easily dismiss, and my father calmly reminded me that I was living under their roof, that everything I had was because of them, and that I owed them more than I probably realized. But this time, I didn't back down. I told them they couldn't take anything from me. And that's when they laughed. Not loudly, not aggressively, but in a way that made it clear they still didn't see me as someone who could actually stand up to them. So I told them the truth. I told them that I had opened my own accounts a long time ago, that everything I earned was in my name, under my control, and that they didn't have access to any of it. And just like that, the room went quiet. For the first time in my life, they didn't interrupt me, they didn't correct me, and they didn't try to turn my words against me. They just sat there. And I could see it on their faces. It wasn't anger. It was not a disappointment. Something else, and something closer to implementation. Because in that moment, they understood something they had never expected. I wasn't the same person they thought I was. I wasn't someone they could control anymore. And I think that scared them more than anything else. I don't remember exactly what they said after that because, honestly, it didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that something had finally shifted. Not in them, in me. That was the moment I stopped trying to earn their approval and started choosing myself instead. And a few days later, I left. Not dramatically, not in the middle of a fight, but quietly, with everything I had built on my own, without asking for permission, and without looking back. And what surprised me the most wasn't that they called. Because they did. It wasn't even that they tried to explain themselves, or said things that sounded almost like apologies. It was how different it all felt. Because for the first time, their words didn't have power over me anymore. They called me a failure. But they never noticed the moment I stopped being one. Be honest, was I wrong for saying no? If stories like this hit you, subscribe.